this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from beautiful Florida. And today we begin the second decade of Reverend Don's vlog. And I'd like to start by thanking everyone who has said kind things about the vlog on the occasion of its anniversary, and I greatly appreciate all of your comments, and I appreciate your being with me on this journey, in some cases from the very beginning. And today I want to speak to one of the comments that was made about the vlog itself in reference to the 10-year anniversary. And that comment comes from John Kennedy. And he had this to say. He congratulated us on our 10 years, and then pointed out that in his experience we were the only channel that took the time to answer anybody's question, big or small. And I wanted to speak to this because I am a believer in the idea that while there might sometimes be bad answers, there are never bad questions, as long as they're real questions. Now, certainly there are people who can troll a channel like this with fake questions, but sometimes even those bring forth good answers and can cause people to think. So I've always felt that all questions were worth looking at. I can't say that I've answered every single question that's ever come into the vlog, because there have been times when they have come fast and furious, and some have been lost in the cracks. But I try to answer as many as I can, and I don't just pick the deeper ones. We've certainly had many questions that dealt with high-level metaphysics. And we've also had many questions that some people might consider silly or flippant, and I've tried to answer all of them. Many of our questions have come from people who might be new to metaphysics or very young. And to be honest, I've actually found these to be some of the most thought-provoking questions. And I think if you go through the vlog, you will see that some of the questions that perhaps another commentator would have dismissed as being silly or naive actually were some of the deepest subjects that we've dealt with. Because I did not just dismiss them, but actually looked at what the subject was. And I think that particularly when the questioner is young or new to the community, they're the very people who most need to have their questions answered in a respectful and thoughtful way. There's a conversation going around recently about elders who feel disrespected and not listened to. And I'm certainly not speaking to all of the people who feel that way, and for the record, I certainly don't feel that way, and most people that I interact with on a regular basis who might be called elders also don't feel that way. But there's definitely a crowd who do. And I have to say that in my several decades in this community, I've often seen people who were in what they considered positions of authority, when faced with younger people or newcomers to the community, be sneeringly dismissive of them. And if a question were asked that perhaps was naive, they would make fun of it, or chase the person off, and then wonder why they weren't respected. Respect is something you have to give if you think you're going to get it. And, if you treat someone who is new to the community badly, of course they're not going to respect you or consider you to be a font of wisdom. This is not a behavior that you associate with wise people. So I have always tried to take all of the questions seriously and to speak to the querent as a serious person regardless of whether perhaps their question might seem simple to me, because I know that I've been here for many years, they may not have been. And to just dismiss their question, I think, would do a disservice to everyone. And also, as I say, very often these questions that on the surface may seem silly or shallow actually have very deep answers. And so I try to answer all of them. And I think that in doing that, we've gone into waters we might not otherwise have gone into. Again, I don't think there's such thing as a bad question, as long as it's a real serious question that someone needs to know about. There have been times I've had to say, well, no, that's not a thing, because of what the question was, but I've tried to do it respectfully and to explain why it's not a thing. And I will also go so far as to say that I have not had every experience in the world, and so I don't necessarily dismiss other people's experiences just because they don't match mine. Sometimes I feel that I would interpret them differently, and I say so. But it's not because I necessarily assume that they haven't actually had it. I think that very often people, particularly without a background in metaphysics, will misunderstand some experiences. And we talked recently about poltergeists. And people often fail to understand that a poltergeist is basically ungrounded energy. But why would they know that if they don't have a background in metaphysics? It's perfectly reasonable for them to have to learn this if they've never heard it before. And in dealing with that sort of thing, it's actually very simple to ground out that energy, usually. But if you didn't know that, you wouldn't know it. So I think that answering all questions is very important. And I think that it would do a great disservice to myself as well as to the questioners to dismiss certain questions just because they weren't necessarily the ones that I myself would ask, because people are at all different levels. My mother was very fond of the saying that you must meet people where you find them, which means that it's all well and good that you have years and years and years of experience, but when you meet someone who doesn't, you have to remember that they don't. Because if you just assume that they know what you know, you will be making a false assumption. And this, I think, is true across the board in life. You have to take people where you find them and try to work with them in the knowledge of where they are, not necessarily where you would like them to be. So, again, I found it very important to treat all questions seriously, and except that one on humor. That was fun. But to try to treat all questions seriously and give them serious answers, because anyone who asks a question, whether they realize it or not, are probably speaking for a lot of other people who haven't asked it. And I think that it would be unfortunate to simply ignore subjects that were not as deep as others. When you first come to any community, you come as a blank slate. And so even very simple questions can be important questions to the person asking them, and I think it would be very foolish to forget that. Now, at another level, again, I found that often the answers to these questions, which may seem simpler or even flippant, can sometimes be the deepest answers of all. The other day we had a question from Afterfove, who has asked many questions over the years, and often comes from very unusual perspectives and asks his questions in a humorous way that don't always on the surface show the depth underneath. But if you look at them, they lead you into deep waters very quickly. And I have found those to be some of the best questions of all. So I certainly believe in looking at all the questions that I get and trying to find the best answer to them, and that's how I've tried to do the vlog for these 10 years. And I certainly know that I could have a much larger audience if I boogie-boogied it up and made it more sensationalistic, but I really don't want to pander to that. I want to give real answers to real questions. And if you're watching this, you must appreciate that. And so I thank you, and I hope that you've enjoyed this vlog, and until next time, may you blessed be.
Elements. Just as there are 4 directions, so too are there 4 elements. The 4 elements are said to be the building blocks of all creation, contained in varying degrees in all things. The elements are usually defined as air, fire, water, and earth, though it should be understood that it is not the physical substances named, but rather the qualities associated with them that are being referred to. It is also allowed that there is a 5th element, spirit, but it is often listed separately from the 4. In different times and cultures, there have been many variations in the theory of the elements, but the basic concept that all living things contain a mixture of the same qualities remains the same.